CúChulainn, young as he was, has lived through a lot of battles and adventures, and had seen more than most men ever will. But every legend has to come to an end. And the day CúChulainn took up arms, he had willingly brought the fate of a short life over himself. And so, this will be the last chapter in the life of CúChulainn. The death of the greatest hero Ireland had ever seen. It all started with Queen Maeve of Connacht, who was still furious that CúChulainn had crossed her plans to invade Ulster, had slain her best warriors, and had refused to take her side during the events of the Cúailgne. She couldn't stand those insults and wanted him gone for good. But to achieve that, she needed new allies. It just so happened that CúChulainn, during his short life, had made a lot of powerful enemies. And so, Maeve in her wrath didn't have any issues finding people to conspire with. She searched for the perfect allies for her plans, and came across the 3 daughters of Celtic, a great druid CúChulainn had slain. Those 3 were of a peculiar kind. Between all 3 of them they had 3 eyes, and their hearts were filled with the desire for revenge. Maeve took them in and sent them off to Scotland and Babylon to be trained in the arts of sorcery and to gather as much knowledge about the arcane arts as possible. But once the daughters of Celtic returned to Connacht, Maeve knew the time was right to set her plan in motion. She managed to once more trigger the curse of Marca, striking every single man in Ulster with the pains of childbirth for several days and nights, making them defenseless and leaving CúChulainn as the only warrior in all of Ulster. When Croagh mac Nessa, the king of Ulster, realized what was going on, he knew he had to do everything to keep CúChulainn from fighting. For CúChulainn was Ulster's only defense, and Maeve was determined and probably most prepared to kill him. And once CúChulainn, the greatest warrior of Ulster, fell, Éamon Macha would most likely fall with him. He tried to distract CúChulainn for as long as possible, but in the end he failed. The daughters of Celtic used the magic they had learned and let the sounds of war be heard from outside of the fort of Éamon Macha to lure CúChulainn out. But Croagh had thought of such a tactic and had invited the best storytellers in all of Ireland to entertain CúChulainn and the women at the court of Éamon Macha. And even though outside of the castle it seemed like large armies battled each other and cried out in agony, Croagh managed to distract CúChulainn for 3 whole days from everything that happened. On the 4th day, though, Croagh knew that he couldn't go on like this. And so, he instructed everybody to go to the nearby valley Glen Nabor, also known as the Valley of the Deaf, for it was in such a shape that no noise from the outside of the valley could reach it, and therefore the illusions the daughters of Celtic had conjured wouldn't work there. When the daughters of Celtic realized that their illusions were of no avail, they quickly hatched a new plan. One of them used her magic to disguise herself as Niamh, a close friend to CúChulainn. In that new shape, she approached the young warrior and pleaded for him to come save the land, for all of Ulster was just about to fall under a dark spell. And that was nothing CúChulainn had to be told twice. He took his weapons, went to his mighty and faithful horse Liath Macha, and tried to hitch him to his chariot. But for the first time since CúChulainn had tamed him, Liath Macha refused, and even cried bloody tears, for the horse knew what was coming for his master. But CúChulainn didn't understand, and scolded his horse for all of a sudden betraying him like this. And thus, knowing there was nothing he can do but stay beside his master, Liamaka let himself be hitched to the chariot by CúChulainn's charioteer Lake, to stay at his master's side until the very end. Before he could leave, his mother Deitere came to him to offer him a cup of wine. CúChulainn accepted, but as soon as his lips touched the liquid, it turned to blood. Deitere didn't know what to say, and gave him another cup, and the same happened. And after this happened for a third time, Deitere pleaded for CúChulainn to not go into battle, for this was more than just a bad omen. This was a warning. But being the warrior he was, CúChulainn left either way. On his way, he came across an old Keening woman at a river, washing clothes. He didn't realize that this was the Morrigan, and asked her whose blood-stained clothes she was washing. The woman looked up and declared that these were his clothes, for he was about to die. CúChulainn was taken aback by this, but rode on. But before he was able to reach the armies of Maeve, he came across 3 old hags. As he approached them, he saw that they were roasting dog meat over an open fire. He foolishly greeted them, and was then invited to eat with them. He was repulsed, for this was disgusting, and above all, he had a gage upon himself, a magical ban to never eat the meat of a dog, for they were his namesakes. But the old hags just grinned, and reminded him that there was also another gage upon him, that he was not allowed to refuse hospitality. Now he was in a dilemma. No matter what he did, he had to break one of his geisha, either refusing the hospitality of the women, or eating dog's meat. When he was still unsure what to do, the women mocked him, saying that he seemed to be too fine for them, being used to eat only fine food at the court, and that their food didn't seem to be good enough for a proud fool like him. Now his honor was attacked, and he had no choice but to accept their hospitality. And so he dismounted his horse and took a bite out of the dog's meat he was offered, breaking the gage laid upon him. As soon as the meat touched his lips, he felt how he was greatly weakened, and even let go of the meat, for his arm didn't have the strength to hold on to it. The old women laughed at him, turned into one, and revealed themselves to be the goddess Morrigan, another mighty woman whose endless wrath CúChulainn had summoned when he had rejected her affections. She vanished, and CúChulainn was left behind, now without the strength of his fairy blood, not stronger than a normal man. Nonetheless, CúChulainn approached the battlefield on the plain of Macmohevne, facing Maeve's armies. There he saw himself confronted with Lugaid, a son of Cooley, with whom he was in rivalry for a long time. He faced him from afar, carrying 3 spears with him, all destined to kill a king, a prophecy his enemies were aware of. But before CúChulainn was even able to use one of them, a druid stepped forth, demanding one of the spears. And since it was forbidden to refuse a demand of a druid, CúChulainn had no choice but to accept. But no one mentioned in what matter he had to deliver the spear. And so he took it and threw it towards the druid, killing him instantly. Lugaid just laughed, took the spear and threw it back at CúChulainn. But he was too angry to aim properly, and so he missed Cuchulainn, but pierced through the body of his charioteer leg instead. And so the king of the charioteers died, leaving Cuchulainn mourning for his longtime friend. Another druid foolishly stepped forward, demanding another spear from Cuchulainn. And as if the druid hadn't learned from his colleague's mistake, Cuchulainn swung the spear, piercing through the second druid. This time, Eric, the king of Leinster, another of Maeve's co-conspirators, stepped forward, took the spear and swung it back at Cuchulainn, missing him by less than an inch, and hitting Liamarca instead. And so, the king of the horses died, and his body vanished, returning to the lake Linlea, where Cuchulainn once had found him. Cuchulainn was devastated. Two of his best friends were lost forever. But before he was able to react, a third druid stepped forward, demanding the third spear. And of course, he died just like the others did. Again, Lugaid stepped forward, took the spear and threw it towards Cuchulainn. And this time, the spear found its target and pierced through Cuchulainn's stomach, mortally wounding him. Cuchulainn knew that his time was come, for through the broken gauge, he didn't have the strength to defeat a whole army in a state. But he didn't want to die crawling on the ground like an animal. He wanted to die like a warrior. And so, he took all the strength he could muster, went to the next standing stone, and tied himself to it, so that he would stand, even if he didn't have the strength for it anymore. Maeve's army didn't dare to come close to him, for they knew what Cuchulainn had done in the past, and even though they saw his wound, they were too afraid to approach him, as long as he was still standing. And so he stood there, with his grip tightly around his sword, which he held over his shoulder, ready to take a blow, waiting for the enemies to approach, while slowly fading away. While he stood there, waiting for the cowards to approach him, he saw a raven tripping over his inyards, and he laughed. And so died Cuchulainn, the king of the warriors, with a laugh on his lips. But still, his enemies weren't sure whether he was really dead, and were way too afraid to approach him. And so he stood there, tied to the stone, dead, for 3 whole days, until the Morrigan, in the shape of a raven, landed on his shoulder to show the man that he was truly gone. It was only now that they dared to approach him, even though they were still afraid. Lugaid was the first one to come close to the corpse, but the arrogant warrior was too cocky and attempted to cut off Cuchulainn's head as a trophy, when suddenly the warrior's grip loosened, and Cuchulainn's sword fell from his shoulders, cutting off the hand of the insolent Lugaid. Word of Cuchulainn's death got around, and once the curse of Marca was broken again, Conall Cernach swore to take revenge for his best friend's death. For he and Cuchulainn had sworn to avenge each other should they fall by the hand of another. And so, Conall didn't rest until he found Lugaid. And though he was furious about his friend's death, Conall was a man of honor. Upon seeing Lugaid's injury, he decided to bind one of his hands on his back before approaching him. The fight was a long one, but in the end, Conall managed to slay Lugaid and to avenge Cuchulainn. But this wasn't the end. Ulster had lost his beloved hero. And so, all of Ulster wanted for vengeance. Slowly but surely, the light of honor shining above Eamon Marcha faded, and Ulster was never the same. And this is the end of the tales surrounding Ireland's greatest hero, the Hound of Ulster, CúChulainn. But his stories and the legends surrounding him live on. So much so that you can even find a bronze statue of him in the GOP, the General Post Office in Dublin, which also has a much bigger significance, but that is a story for another day. If you like the video, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and ring the bell to be notified when the next video comes out. See you next time. Slán slán!